Hi, I'm back. Over the past few videos, we've been focusing on really three lifelong habits that are going to help us to identify, to find, and to recognize the people that God is drawing to himself. The first one of those is to pray for people. We've identified 5 people. We're going to pray for them every day, asking God to draw them. The second is to listen for when people express a problem or a need and to pray with them out loud right then. The third is to learn to respond to questions in a way that lets people know, hey, this is a guy who really loves God, using the gatepost statements that we practiced last time. Now I want to start focusing on a couple of specific skills. One is to share your own story, the story of what God has done in your life, in about a minute, and that's what we're going to do in this video. And the second, which we'll do in the next video, is to share a simple gospel presentation in about 3 minutes. And the reason I'm focusing on time, 1 minute, 3 minutes, is because we live in an impatient culture. And often what happens when we evangelize is we want to share with somebody, we're nervous, and so we don't. And finally, we get up the nerve to share with them, and when we do, it's as if we back up the dump truck and unload the whole thing. We just tell them everything we know. And by the end of that, the person is thinking, I'm never going to talk to this guy about spiritual things again. It takes too long. That's not what we want to do. What we want to do is to give them a little bit of information, to watch how they respond, and if they want more, to give them more. So we're going to practice now telling your story in 1 minute. And the great thing is, if we talk about the Bible or we talk about theology or we talk about whatever, people can argue with us. But each of us are literally the world's greatest experts on our own story. And so it's very difficult to argue with your story. Okay, now I want to walk you through an exercise to tell your story in a minute. And we want to do it in a minute because we live in a very impatient culture. And so if we take longer than that, people don't want to listen. You're going to need a piece of paper and a writing implement. So take your piece of paper, and your story is divided into 3 parts. The first part is before, so write before on the top of your paper. The middle part is how, and the last part is after. And this describes how your life was before you decided to follow Jesus as your king, how, what it is that you learned from whom, how it was that you decided to follow Jesus, and the last part is after, what your life is like after you've decided to follow Jesus. And here underneath before, draw 2 lines and do the same thing underneath after. And I want you to think about your life before you decided to follow Jesus, and think of 2 words that describe your life before you decided to follow Jesus. For me, those words would be empty and without purpose. Because before I decided to follow Jesus, that's how I felt. I felt empty and without purpose. So pause the video and take a minute to write down the 2 words that describe your life before you decided to follow Jesus. Now, I want you to think of 2 words that describe your life after you decided to follow Jesus. If it were me, I would put down meaning. Now my life is full of meaning and purpose. And love. I find my life filled with loving relationships. It's really wonderful. So pause the video and write down 2 words that describe your life after you decided to follow Jesus. Now, in this middle section, you're going to describe how it was that you learned about the gospel and made the decision to follow Jesus. And at a minimum, we want to include, if we can, these things. I learned that Jesus came to the world. I learned that he died to pay for my sins and that he rose from the dead. And I made the decision to follow him as my king. So think about how you came to understand the gospel and made the decision to follow Jesus, and write out a sentence or 2 describing that. Now let's go back to the before section. Take the words that you wrote and write out 1 sentence, sort of filling out each of those words, filling out how it was that I was empty, how it was that I was without purpose. And do the same thing down in the after section. Write a sentence next to each word that you used to describe how your life was after you started to follow Jesus. Okay, by now you should have written down your before, your how, and your after. My guess is some of you are thinking, well, I grew up in a Christian home. I don't really have a before and an after. And my observation from talking to a lot of people is that it may be true that you've always believed in God, but almost always there's a point in time where you started to understand God's grace, or where you committed yourself fully to follow him. And treat that as the time. And if you need to, pause the video now and go back and rework your before, how, and after to reflect that. Now that you've got that together, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your before, your how, and your after, and I want you to squeeze those together into a single story that you can tell in about a minute. And we're going to practice. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example of my story. And then after that, I'm going to set a timer for 1 minute, and I'm going to ask you to go and practice it once. Almost for sure you won't finish in a minute, but we're going to stop at a minute. And then you're going to think about what can you eliminate, how can you simplify, and I'll set a timer for a minute and we'll practice again. And we'll repeat that process again, and we'll intersperse in that some examples of friends of ours telling their stories. Okay? So here's my example. When I was young, I was an atheist. I didn't believe in God, and I was reasonably good. I was doing the things I was supposed to do, but I felt basically empty and without purpose. And I met some friends who were really following Jesus, and Jesus had changed their life. I hadn't seen that before. So I started reading the Bible, and I thought I knew what the Bible said. I thought the Bible says, well, there's these rules, and if you follow enough of the rules enough of the time, you're in, and if not, you're out. Turns out that's not what it says at all. What it says is we all flunk, and the reason Jesus came and died was to pay for what we have done so he can offer forgiveness and new life, not as something earned, but as a gift. And when I learned that, I thought, that is the best deal ever. And so in November of 1976, I committed myself to follow Jesus as my king. And it has totally changed my life. Now my life is full of meaning, is full of purpose, is full of loving relationships with my wife, my family, with the God who made me, with friends all over the world. So I recommend it to everybody. But God gives each person the respect, the dignity of deciding for themselves. Do you have a story like that? Okay, now it's your turn to practice. Did you see how I took my before, my how, I encapsulated the gospel in the how, and then my after, and then ended with something that asked for a response from them. We want you to do those same things. So I'm going to ask Siri to set a timer for a minute and give you a chance to practice. You ready? Hey Siri, set timer for 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute and counting.
Halfway through. Okay, time's up. I know most of you probably didn't finish, but it's all right, just stop. Stop and ask yourself, how can I simplify so I can get it done in a minute? And right now I just want to pause and we're going to look at an example of somebody who's sharing their story.
There was a time in my life where I felt really lonely and I was just seeking truth. And there's this really hairy man, Zach Medlock, who shared with me how Jesus had changed his life. And then I started reading the Bible and saw that God had sent his only son into the world so people didn't have to live in the dark anymore. And I just trusted that. And ever since then, God has just given me so much joy and peace and purpose. Do you have a story like that?
Alrighty, now we're going to practice again. You ready? Again, I'm going to set a timer for a minute. You're going to share, and I'll stop you at the end of the minute. Hey Siri, set timer for 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute and counting.
"15 seconds left. You should be wrapping up. Oh, time's up. How'd you do this time? My guess is you still didn't quite make it in a minute. Again, you need to think, how can I simplify so that I can get it done? Let's take a look at another example.
Hi, my name is Grace, and I actually grew up in a Christian home, and I always loved God, but there was a time in my life when I didn't really understand His grace, and so I wanted to be good, and I wanted to be approved of, and I wanted to be the best, but I did that all on my own strength. And then when I got to college, I saw people around me who didn't know or love God. So I decided I had to decide what I believe. So I started reading the Bible and praying, and I met some people who were really committed to following God, and that changed my whole life. I became full of God's Spirit, and I learned that we get to follow Him as a free gift. We don't earn it, and that has brought me joy and purpose, and I want everyone to experience what I've experienced. So that's my story. What's yours?
Alrighty, time for one more practice session. Again, I'm going to set a timer for a minute, and you can practice sharing. Hey Siri, Set timer for 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute and counting.
Time's up. How'd you do? How did you do? Okay, your homework for this week is to practice at least 3 more times sharing your story in 1 minute. And find somebody, they can be a believer, that's fine. Find somebody to practice with and practice at least 3 more times. And from here on out, next week and the week after and the rest of your life, you've got this tool which you're ready to use when you start to see somebody who seems like they might be interested in learning more about Jesus. Just share your story, watch how they respond, and if they seem interested, you can continue with the next tool we're going to learn. That is the gospel in 3 minutes using the 3 circles. See you next time.